Hi, so this is the video of Montuhotep II, also known as Nebhepetra. He was really the first king of the 11th dynasty and the birth of the Middle Kingdom. So let's have a quick review about the first intermediate period. What's happening in Waset, which is where Montuhotep came from? Well, it's the Intef Hotep family. So the first guy is Intef the Elder. Then after him comes Montuhotep I, then Intef the second, Intef the third, Intef the first, Intef the second, and Intef the third. Now, the three Intefs had their burials in what we call a saf row, so the tombs were next door to each other, and we believe that on top of that natural mound in the cliff, they most probably had mud brick pyramids built on top, solid ones, nothing special, but to them it represented the creation mound. Now I'll do a video on creationists because there's so many that the Egyptians had that it needs a separate video. So what's happening? Well, these guys are fighting their neighbours. They're fighting the known down at Thebes, Elephantine and Abydos. And it seems to be going on for a long time. So we're talking all of these different leaders are in conflict with their neighbours. Eventually, Nebhepetra, who eventually becomes Montuhotep II, sends out that advert. Do you remember that advert? That's quite a cheeky one on my part. So, infantry and bowmen required, good rates of pay. So he's going down to Kush, which is modern day Sudan, to get more troops. As I mentioned in my last video on Waset, there were probably 4 regional nomarchs fighting for the right to be king of Egypt. The nomarchs in Middle Egypt, the Heracleopolis, they declared themselves as kings of Egypt. I don't think they had enough military muscle. They needed the support of the other 3 nomarchs, which they didn't get. But we do know that Thebes was in league with the Middle Egyptian family. So maybe that's why the Intef and Montuhotep family felt that they needed to go to war. Maybe they disagreed because the so-called king, as Manetho quite rightly said, was not empowered with kingship. He took the throne. And maybe that's why the Intef Hotep family decided that they would make war on Heracleopolis and Thebes. So he's going down to Kush to recruit some mercenaries. Egypt doesn't have money. What's he going to do? Is he going to offer to pay them in food and cattle? I don't think so. But what's interesting, he did have 7 wives, Montuhotep, and 2 of them are depicted in paintings as being black Africans. And I think he did a deal down there. I think he got into some politics there. And he offered that once the conflict was won and over, he would marry 2 princesses and make them queens of Egypt. And he would come down and settle the claim that maybe these 2 chieftains or 1 chieftain had about ruling Kush. After all, the Egyptians were never interested in ruling Kush. They just want access to the gold mines. That's all they're really interested in, is the flesh of the gods. It's quite a barren land. It doesn't have lots of fertile soil like Egypt. So what they're interested in more than anything is access to quarries in Kush and also the gold mines. And if they could do a deal there, I'm sure that's probably what happened. Anyway, so Montuhotep starts his campaign to unify the country. He's got a Horus name. He's got 3 Horus names. But in the 14th year, he takes one last Horus name. So it's almost as if you can follow his success in campaigns, that he ups his game a bit. And the Horus name says that he's the unifier of the two lands. He's got two ladies' titles, but in his 14th year, when he unifies Egypt into one nation again, it's the ladies' titles is the uniter of the two lands. He always had a golden Horus, he didn't change that. And his gnomon is really interesting. He had two gnomons. Second one says that he's the Lord of the rudder of Ra. Well, the sun god travelled around on the solar bark. And so what he's suggesting is that, being the dutiful son of the sun god Ra, he's on the rudder of that solar bark or boat, whichever you prefer to describe it. His gnomon, which is his birth name, his secret name, that only his immediate family would know him by, is Montuhotep, which means Montu is satisfied. Well, once peace had been restored, there were many pleasant years of peace in Egypt. So we're talking about his reign is, well, what he claims his reign starts at 2065 BCE. And he rules Egypt for 51 years. Now, many of those years, I think, those first 14 years, he wasn't the king of Upper and Lower Egypt at that time. He was assuming those titles to get that national fever up, to get a unification going. It's his 14th year in his reign, I believe he was successful in conquering Middle and Lower Egypt. So he's had this professional army for 14 years. What does he do with it? Well, he sends them down to Kush, which is why I think he did a deal with the chieftains down there, that he would settle local disputes and empower the chieftains to be the rulers of Kush. He then sends his army off to Canaan. Well, Canaan was really difficult for the Egyptians. They had always had incursions coming in from Canaan, migrants of people, and they weren't particularly that keen on them. They called them those who dwell across the sand, and they saw them as troublemakers. They didn't cooperate. And the one thing that the Egyptians did was they cooperated. Everyone cooperated. Everyone knew their place in society. They lived a good life and they cooperated. Whereas the Canaanites are fighting each other. Village, village, town, town, city, city. And every now and again, the Egyptians had to go there and sort them out, because vital trade routes came through Canaan, from Lebanon down through Canaan. So it was important to keep those trade routes open. Then he sends his army off to smite the Libyans. The Libyans were always raiding Egypt from the desert, and then going back into the desert. So they had to be taught a lesson. They had to be kept down. So especially during this first intermediate period, when maybe the Old Kingdom forts in the desert had been abandoned, and then the incursion of the Libyans would have been happening for not for a few years, but a couple of hundred years. So it was important to put those chieftains down. And the Libyans were semi-nomadic people. They wandered round with herds of cattle and goats and sheep, and then they settled down every year when the season was right, grow some food, collect the harvest, and then go back wandering. So they were quite a troublesome people for the Egyptians to deal with. Okay, so that's what he did with his army. Then he looked at the government. No more nomarchs were going to rule Egypt. So no more titles are going to be passed on from father to son. That was all abolished. No more viziers for Upper and Lower Egypt. From now on, there are going to be governors, and it's going to be the king who appoints the governors. So he appointed a governor for Upper Egypt and another governor for Lower Egypt, solely under his control. Then he looked upon about building his funeral monument. And that's what we're going to look at next. So he chose Deir El Bahri on the west bank of Waset. Remember, the Greeks called Waset Thebes, and today it's called Luxor. And he chose to build at Deir El Bahri, and it's to do with that mountain. We know that during the New Kingdom times, the mountain was dedicated to Isis. And maybe that's why the Intefs chose to have their Sappho tombs on that side of the mountain. And maybe that's why Montuhotep II chose to build his funeral monument at Deir El Bahri, because the mountain was dedicated to Isis. And Isis is the mother of Horus. And the first title of every king of Egypt is Horus. So in many ways, he's been buried in his mother's mountain. Well, a successful reign of 51 years is going to bring a really good monument. So as you approach that front door, you see it's got a causeway. Originally, it was lined with trees either side. 55 sycamore trees. Why did he choose sycamore trees? Well, it's associated with the goddess Isis. And 6 tanzanite trees, maybe for their flagrant smells of unguents for mummification. On the right hand side, there were statues of the king, seated and standing, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, on the south side, On the north side, the king is in standing and seated positions, wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt. So he's got that symmetry, that mark, that balance. So you've got white and red either side, the two lands, the Nebhepetra, marked balance. That's what his architect's looking for. We don't know who his architect was, but he built these trees and he had these statues commissioned. Look at the statues. They're all big and clumsy. They're probably produced by stonemasons who work in the quarries. You know, these rough and ready guys, the meat and two veg guys. And what you really needed was artists and sculptors. Well, this first intermediate period, there was no central authority. So there's not many highly skilled workmen around to do this type of work. So this work is going to be relearned over the next 2 or 3 generations. That's why the king's got such big feet. And wow, he's got even bigger feet than I have. So that's the reason why the art during this 11th dynasty is so clumsy. Now, right in front of the causeway, Howard Carter was riding in this part of Deir El Bahri, and his horse fell into a pit, and his horse was called the Babel Hussein. And when Howard Carter looked, he found that that was a secret tomb belonging to Montuhotep II. Remember, the Old Kingdom kings always had their tomb, their pyramid or mastaba, then they had a dummy tomb, the security tomb, just in case somebody violated their burial. And that's what this Babel Hassan is. It's a dummy tomb. You go down the causeway, so when the king is buried in his monument, he's still expecting people to come and visit, pilgrims and such. So I'm sure he installed a mortuary cult to feed his spirits, and that meant giving them mortuary lands, which would probably be controlled by the governors. The first tier, so we go up a ramp to the first tier. Now, the first tier would have been for those pilgrims to come and ask their favours. And maybe there were originally statues up there, very similar to Zosa, seated statues, so people could go and lay their offerings and ask the favours of the dead king spirit. As you go further in, there's a courtyard for the more important visitors, the wealthier ones. And then at the back of that is the descending passageway going down 150 meters. When you get to the bottom there, you're 45 meters below ground level, and you come into a white alabaster chapel. That would have probably been just for the immediate family. In front of there are 2 wooden doors, and in behind those wooden doors is the burial chamber of the king, all lined with pink granite. And of course, that's where the king was buried. Now, unfortunately, it was robbed. Of course it was, because there's another intermediate period to come at the end of the 12th dynasty. Splinters of wood being found in there of red cedar wood, so maybe his coffin was made out of red cedar wood from Lebanon, and it was most probably made in the anthropoid fashion. Okay, so when they had access to trees again in Waset, they kept with that original design of the anthropoid design of a person's body rather than rectangular coffins. There was also a boat there because the king's spirit would need to travel to the afterlife and back every night. And there was an upgrade to Ushabti figures. So in the Old Kingdom, there were single Ushabti figures. In what we call the Middle Kingdom, which is what we're in now, they have scenes of Ushabti figures. So breweries, bakers, slaughterhouses, that sort of thing. And we've got a change now. We've got a real change in society. People are being valued. They're not counted like they were in the Old Kingdom. They're not going to be driven with a stick anymore. They're going to be offered a carrot. That carrot is more noticeable in the 12th dynasty, but it gives access to the afterlife to everyone. Okay. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the tour. Unfortunately, this site is closed. You would have to get special permission from the site inspector on the West Bank, and that's not very favourable most of the time because he is a very busy man with huge responsibility. So getting an interview with him is really difficult, unless you're an archaeologist, of course. So I'm not going to ask for a donation for this tour. I will hopefully go back to Waset, Thebes, Luxor in the future and make the tour, and it'll be posted online free. It would be appreciated if you could push the subscribe button. Now the subscribe button, which is for YouTube, doesn't cost you anything. If I get 100 subscribers, they will give this channel its own domain name. So that's what I'm aiming for. So only just click on that subscribe button and it'd be really helpful for me. And I'll see you real soon. So take care. Bye for now.